everyone! Welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I have another podcast episode for you today. So I usually alternate between showing you what I'm working on and a dedicated theme podcast, and this is one of the themed episodes. And I decided to try something new this year and do some reading updates not at the end of the month, at the beginning of the next month, to tell you what I've been reading, since that is another big hobby of mine. And I know there's a lot of readers in the fiber arts community, so I figured, why not share that on YouTube as well? This one might be a little funky. I'm still kind of playing with how I want to do this format-wise, because I don't actually read a ton of physical books. A lot of the ones I read are online, or they're ones that I don't own. They go back to whatever library they came from. So I'm going to have to I won't be able to show physical copies of all of the books that I'm talking about. Most of them, especially for this month, were either digital or already returned. So we'll just go through them one by one, and I'll tell you everything that I read. So I have now read 12 books this month, which is a lot, even for me. I think last year I only had 1 month where I read that many books, and it was over the summer. So definitely not my usual count for books, but I started off this year by reading a bunch of middle grade fantasy books, because that's what my 5th grade students that I'm long-term subbing for are currently reading, and their program has them in little book clubs that they're working on. And I wanted to read as many of their book club books as I could so that I would be able to help them with their schoolwork and their assignments and everything. And since I read pretty fast, I was able to get in a lot of them, so that worked out well. I am going to go in chronological order of when I finish the books, because that's the easiest way to do it from my phone. But let's just dive in. Before I talk about the first book I read, the app that I use to track my reading is called Storygraph, which I really like because it gives a lot more data about your reading than Goodreads does. It gives you little pie charts of the moods of the books that you read, and what genres you typically read and stuff like that. So there's just it's a lot more data heavy than Goodreads is. It also has the ability to follow your friends to see what they're reading. You can do a buddy read on Storygraph, which I haven't tried yet, but would like to at some point. And also, Storygraph is not owned by Amazon like Goodreads is, so there are some books that are easier to find, and I find that the average rating of the book seems a little bit more accurate than the Goodreads ones do, because since Goodreads is linked to Amazon, you get more spam reviews because it's connected to the Amazon reviews of books. And also Amazon's going to maybe add more positive reviews to books that are within their publishing group or that they promote and stuff like that. So I like that this is independent of a big book selling company. And it just makes it a little bit more of an accurate reading experience for me. And I've also found that the recommendations that pop up through Storygraph, specifically for me, are a lot more accurate than the ones I was getting on Goodreads. Also, if you are a Goodreads user, you can download your data and import it to Storygraph. So with all that being said, let's actually dive into the books that I read. So the first one that I finished this month was Gregor the Overlander. And unfortunately, I can't zoom in on the book cover. I was hoping I would be able to, but that is what it looks like. This was a book that I actually had read, if not actually in middle school, then definitely in high school, but it's by the same author as The Hunger Games, but it's definitely a middle grade book. The target age is maybe 4th grade to 7th grade. I think for each of these, I'll go ahead and read the blurb that goes with it and then give you my review of the book. So this book is labeled as fiction, fantasy, middle grade, and the moods for it are adventurous, emotional, and fast-paced. This irresistible first novel tells the story of a quiet boy who embarks on a dangerous quest in order to fulfill his destiny and find his father in a strange world beneath New York City. When Gregor falls through a grate in the laundry room of his apartment building, he hurtles into the dark underland, where spiders, rats, cockroaches coexist uneasily with humans. This world is on the brink of war, and Gregor's arrival is no accident. A prophecy foretells that Gregor has a role to play in the Underland's uncertain future. Gregor wants no part of it until he realizes it's the only way to solve the mystery of his father's disappearance. Reluctantly, Gregor embarks on a dangerous adventure that will change both him and the Underland forever. This is one of the book club books for my students, being that it's a middle grade fantasy. And I loved this book, both as an adult reader and what I remember from reading it initially, so I gave it 5 stars. I would say if you have readers in your life of this age who like the kind of science fiction, more dystopian side of things, but aren't quite ready for things like The Hunger Games or Divergent, like that level of books, this is a really good stepping stone for that. I also really like books that have both a very relatable male main character and a female main character, which this book does have. Gregor obviously is our main character. The series is named after him, but he also meets a girl named Luxa, who is from the Underland, and she is also very much a strong player in the storyline. I would also say that if you have a student who loved City of Ember, this is like City of Ember, but in reverse, is how I described it to my kids. So, more finding the Underland instead of like escaping from the underground city to above ground. I believe this is also loosely based on Alice in Wonderland, which you can definitely tell from the way it's written. But it's more in the, like, plausible fantasy. Like, there's talking animals, but it makes sense for the way the story is set up. So I wouldn't call it, like, it's definitely not high fantasy like Lord of the Rings. And it's not like Harry Potter where there's, like, a magic system, at least not in this book. I can't remember if there is in later books, but it is the first of a series. But I gave it 5 stars. For me as an adult reader, it was a quick read. My kids who are reading it right now seem to really be enjoying it. The second book that I finished was an adult book, not one of my kids' books, and it was The Only One Left by Riley Sager. And I have read a couple books by this author before and really enjoyed all of them. I gave this one 4 stars. It wasn't like super fantastic in my opinion, but I did really enjoy reading it. I will read this is labeled as fiction and thriller, and the moods are dark, mysterious, tense, and medium paced. That is something that Storygraph does really well. It doesn't just give the genre for the book, it gives kind of the overall like vibe of the book, which I really appreciate. The description says, now reduced to a schoolyard chant, the Hope family murders shocked the Maine coast one bloody night in 1929. While most people assume 17-year-old Lenora was responsible, the police were never able to prove it. Other than her denial after the killings, she has never spoken publicly about that night, nor has she set foot outside Hope's End, the cliffside mansion where the massacre occurred. It's now 1983, and home health aide Kit McDeer arrives at a decaying Hope's End to care for Lenora after her previous nurse fled in the middle of the night. In her 70s and confined to a wheelchair, Lenora was rendered mute by a series of strokes and can only communicate with Kit by tapping out sentences on an old typewriter. One night, Lenora uses it to make a tantalizing offer. I want to tell you everything. As Kit helps Lenora write about the events leading to the Hope family massacre, it becomes clear there's more to the tale than people know. But when new details about her predecessor's departure come to light, Kit starts to suspect Lenora might not be telling the complete truth, and that the seemingly harmless woman in her care could be far more dangerous than she first thought. I did really like this book. I wouldn't say it was like my favorite thriller, which is why I didn't give it 5 stars, but I really liked the juxtaposition between the details of the story that happened in 1929 versus 1983. It also gave me some like vague Stranger Things vibes, which I think is partially just the 80s setting of the like later part of the story. But especially season 4 of Stranger Things that takes place in the like spooky house, it kind of felt like that. So really good thriller. It was a really fast read. It wasn't so scary that it like kept me up at night, but it was definitely enough like suspense that I wanted to keep going. So if you are a thriller reader, you will probably like it. The next book is another kids one. This was the first in the Sisters Grimm series called The Fairy Tale Detectives. And there's a couple different covers for this book, so this is not what the version I actually read looked like. But there's definitely a couple of different editions. This one, for genres, is labeled as fiction, fantasy, middle grade, and mystery. And the moods are adventurous, mysterious, and fast-paced. And I gave this one 3 stars. The description says, for Sabrina and Daphne Grimm, life has not been a fairy tale. After the mysterious disappearance of their parents, the sisters are set to live with their grandmother, a woman they believed was dead. Granny Relda reveals that the girls have 2 famous ancestors, the Brothers Grimm, whose classic book of fairy tales is actually a collection of the case files of magical mischief. Now the girls must take on the family responsibility of being fairy tale detectives. I gave this one 3 stars because it was fine. I, as an adult reader, found it very cheesy and like over the top with the number of fairy tale references being made. And it kind of felt like the type of book that should be a Cartoon Network cartoon, if that makes sense. It was definitely like a very silly vibe, which based on like the original cover, I would not have guessed that. However, the kids in my class who are reading it absolutely love it. So clearly, middle grade readers, the target audience, think it's great. I would say if your child who's reading this, or person in your life who is of this age reading this, if they're someone who has already tackled things like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, this is going to be too silly for them. But if you have someone who's like approaching longer chapter books, like is past the like little skinny chapter books and is starting to get into longer ones, this might be a good fit. Especially since so many of the characters are familiar and recognizable. And it is a mystery, so you are kind of like collecting clues along with the characters, but it's also not that hard to figure out. So I could see it being a really satisfying read for someone who is of middle grade age, so like 3rd through 5th grade. Maybe even up into middle school, depending on the kid. So, not my favorite. I think I even wouldn't have liked this as a kid, but the novelty of it, I could see being very appealing to a lot of kids. I was someone who was ahead in reading as a kid. And I still, like, picked silly books occasionally, but not that silly. Like, I remember really liking Bunnicula, but that was more in, like, 2nd grade to maybe 4th grade-ish that I liked those, but Harry Potter was my main thing that I really liked, so take this one with a grain of salt. It was fine. If your kid likes it, it's not something that's going to be annoying. It's not in the same category as, like, the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books that I just can't stand. But it was fine. Not terrible, just fine. The next book I finished is another middle grade fantasy book. This is Willowdene by Catherine Applegate. And I was really drawn in by the cover for this one. This one, the genre is fiction, children's, and fantasy. Why this one got labeled as children's and not middle grade, I'm not really sure, but it is. And the moods are adventurous, emotional, mysterious, and medium-paced. And I gave this one 4 stars. The description is, the earth is old and we are not, and that is all you must remember. 11-year-old Willowdene adores creatures of all kinds, but her favorites are the most unlovable beasts in the land. strange beasts known as screechers. The villagers of Perchance call them pests, even monsters, but Willowdene believes the animals serve a vital role in the complicated web of nature. Lately, though nature has seemed angry indeed, Perchance has been cursed with fires and mudslides, droughts and fevers, and even the annual migration of hummingbirds, a source of local pride and income, has dwindled. For as long as anyone can remember, the tiny animals have overwintered in shimmering bubble nests perched atop blue willow trees, drawing tourists from far and wide. This year, however, not a single hummingbird has returned to Perchance, and no one knows why. When a handmade birthday gift brings unexpected magic to Willowdene and her new friend Connor, she's determined to speak up for the animals she loves and perhaps even uncover the answer to the mystery of the missing hummingbirds. A timely and timeless tale about our fragile earth and one girl's fierce determination to make a difference. This book was very cute. Like, just kind of a sweet story. Very heavy on the environmental issues stuff. But I think in a way that was important and manageable for kids to understand. It's really more focused on symbiotic relationships in nature or how animals interact in a specific biome. So the science teacher in me really loved that topic in a fantasy setting. But again, just kind of something to go into the book with that in mind. If you're reading as an adult, this will be a very fast read for you. And if you have a kid reading it, this is, I think younger kids could handle it if they have the reading level for it. But I would still put it pretty firmly in the middle grade level, maybe like 3rd through 5th grade. Probably it would be too easy for middle school. But I gave it 4 stars. I enjoyed reading it, even as an adult. So that one was pretty good. I do generally like Catherine Applegate's books for kids, and there's actually another one by her that I read for this. There are actually 2, but one of them I finished in December, so I'm not going to talk about that one. But, and it's the next one on my list. So the next book I read was Crenshaw by Catherine Applegate. This is what it looks like. Giant black cat. This one I gave this one 5 stars, which I think I maybe put the wrong stars on those 2 books. I think I meant to give Willowdene 5 stars and Crenshaw 4 stars, but whatever. They were both like kind of about the same I enjoyed them, but they're not like my favorite children's book I've ever read. For genres, this one is labeled as fiction, children's, fantasy, and middle grade. So this one got children's and middle grade. And the moods are adventurous and fast-paced. The description says, Jackson and his family have fallen on hard times. There's no more money for rent and not much for food either. His parents, his little sister, and their dog may have to live in their minivan again. Crenshaw is a cat. He's large, he's outspoken, and he's imaginary. He has come back into Jackson's life to help him, but is an imaginary friend enough to save this family from losing everything. So this book, I kind of pitched it to my students as, if you don't like fantasy, this is the book for you to read for these book clubs. Because all of the issues are very real issues. There just happens to be a large imaginary cat there while it's happening. But I would also argue that this book is a good way to teach students about financial struggle, especially for kids who have not witnessed that or seen anybody go through that. It dealt with it in a very kid-friendly, approachable way, with some real-life examples of a child going through knowing that his family could be homeless. But there's also a large imaginary cat. So it definitely had a good balance of like lighthearted, silly moments with the more serious topics that it was addressing. So maybe that is why I gave it 5 stars. It was more for how it addressed that big topic. But recommend it, especially if you are trying to teach your kids or children in your life about being sensitive to people with financial struggles. I think this is a really good tool to teach that. And I would definitely put it in the like 3rd to 5th grade category again. Very sweet ending. And also just talking about imaginary friends in general. It was a really interesting premise. Next one I read was The Castle in the Attic. And this one was also a middle grade fiction book, or fantasy book. I only gave this one 2 stars. And I'll talk about why in a minute, but I do want to say that I'm not against older literature for children, but I think some of them just don't age as well as others do. Like, we know The Chronicles of Narnia is considered now a timeless classic. I think there's a reason why this one's not quite in that category. But the description is, when William learns that his favorite caretaker, Mrs. Phillips, is leaving, he is devastated. But then she gives him her parting gift, a mysterious model castle that has been in her family for years. The castle is perfect in every way, with a drawbridge, a moat, and a finger-high knight to guard the gates. It's almost too real. Sure enough, when William picks up the tiny silver knight, Sir Simon comes alive in his hand and tells William a mighty story of wild sorcery, wizards, and a kingdom in need of saving. Hoping the castle's magic holds the key to getting his friend to stay, William embarks on a fantastic quest to another land and another time, where a fiery dragon and an evil wizard are waiting to do battle. So again, I gave this one 2 stars. This also kind of fell in the, like, overdone cheesy category for me. Although my students who are reading it now seem to enjoy it. I just didn't like it. I found that it didn't hold my attention, even though all of the, like, plot points of it I would think I would be really interested in. I'm curious, like, well, it's not that I can find out, but I wonder if I had read this as a kid, if I would have liked it more. But reading it as an adult, I kind of saw just more of the parts of it that didn't age very well. Not that anything specific comes to mind, but I definitely noticed that there were some references that didn't make sense anymore, or I wouldn't have described things the way that the author did. But it is an older book. How old is it actually? 1985. So it's not ancient, but definitely dated, we'll say that. Also, just I had kids asking what a caretaker was, which was kind of funny to me, because that is not something that my students see. So kind of the opposite end of Crenshaw. This book had more, like, wealth-related things to it that just don't really happen anymore. Or at least not in the tax bracket that I currently live in. So that was kind of an interesting explanation to the kids. But yeah, 2 stars. It was fine. Again, if your kids like it, that's fine. Oh, the next one I forgot to give a rating to. So the next one, another middle grade fantasy. Again, there's going to be a lot of those. This was the Field Guide, which is the first of the Spiderwick Chronicles series. I also read these as a kid and was obsessed with them for a while. Like, had all the books, had all the companion books. I have now seen that there is a spin-off series that was not around when I was a kid, but probably would have loved that too. Definitely loved this one when I was a child. This one for genre is fiction, children's fantasy. The mood is adventurous, lighthearted, mysterious, fast-paced. I forgot to review this one. I think as a kid, I definitely would have given this 5 stars. It's probably more of a 4 as an adult. But it did have a very interesting premise. So this one says, the Grace children discover the fairy world is closer than you think in this oh, that was the, like, New York Times blurb. The actual description says, after finding a mysterious handmade field guide in the attic of the ramshackle old mansion they've just moved into, Jared, his twin brother Simon, and their older sister Mallory discover that there's a magical and maybe dangerous world existing parallel to our own, the world of fairy. The Grace children want to share their story, but fairies will do everything possible to stop them. So this was a really short book, first of all. I remember reading these books as a kid and thinking of the whole series, like, as a single book, because each book is about 100 pages and there's lots of pictures. So they go really, really fast. But I would say that the artwork was one of the big draws to these books. So part of the storyline is that they find this handmade field guide that talks about like all sorts of fairies and little creatures, and the pictures are just so interesting, both of the actual characters and of the creatures. And I know that eventually they did publish like the actual field guide that the kids find in the story, and that was the part that I was really into, was like looking at all the pictures of the creatures and all that stuff. So we're not doing that in class. I think the kids who are reading this one in class are kind of over it because it was almost too short for them, especially compared to some of the other books that were on this list. But they like the setup of it. So they definitely asked if there were more books. So I told them, yes, there are, but we don't have a ton of copies. The library might have them. But I do remember, once I reread this, I remembered that the fact that the older sister Mallory does fencing was why I tried to do fencing in high school. That was where I had first heard of that as a sport. I did not last very long in fencing because it conflicted with marching band and I couldn't do both. But it like, I had that light bulb moment of like, oh yeah, that's why I tried to do fencing in high school. It was because Mallory was on the fencing team in these books. This is definitely like less on the cheesy side, more on the like sort of spooky end of children's fantasy, but I recommend it especially if you have kids who are into Narnia. This is more on the Narnia side than Harry Potter, but the like finding mysterious magical things train of thought, this would work well for you. I think the next one is the last kid book on this list. The next one is called Bob by Rebecca Steed and Wendy Mass. And here's the cover. I gave this one 4 stars. The genres are fiction, fantasy, and middle grade, and it's labeled as emotional and medium paced for the moods. Description says, it's been 5 years since Livy and her family have visited Livy's grandmother in Australia. Now that she's back, Livy has the feeling she's forgotten something really, really important about Gran's house. It turns out she's right. Bob, a short greenish creature dressed in a chicken suit, didn't forget Livy or her promise. He's been waiting 5 years for her to come back, hiding in a closet like she told him to. He can't remember who or what he is, where he came from, or if he even has a family. But 5 years ago, Livy promised she would help him find his way back home. Now it's time to keep that promise. Clue by clue, Livy and Bob will unravel the mystery of where Bob comes from and discover the kind of magic that lasts forever. So this book is heavy on the Lilo and Stitch vibes. The way the characters interact with each other just reminded me of that movie so much. But it also was kind of fun to have a book that was not set in the US. And I think, other than ones that are in like a purely fantasy setting, this was the only one of my books that the kids are reading that was set in another country. So there's a lot of like cool Australia things that are mentioned. And it was also just a really sweet story about family and remembering things and helping others. So definitely reminded me of Lilo and Stitch. So if you have kids in your life who like that movie, they'll probably like this book as well. There's not much else I can say about it without giving away major spoilers, but it was very, very sweet. Also a pretty fast read. It's 200 pages, but there's lots of pictures. So another very cute one. And now the other books on here are all for grown-ups. So if you were not here for the children's literature, there's some more things in here. The next one is another Riley Sager book. This one was Home Before Dark. Looks like this. And this one, I don't have the physical copy. Actually, this one and the other Riley Sager one, I don't have the physical copy because I checked these both out using Libby, which is the ebook app, or the app to check out ebooks and audiobooks from the library. Highly recommend checking it out. If your library doesn't have Libby, they probably have a similar program. You can always check with one of your reference desk librarians to ask what programs they offer or what apps they offer to check out digital books whether they're audio or ebooks. I gave this one 4 stars. The genres are labeled as fiction, horror, mystery, and thriller, and the moods are dark, mysterious, tense, and fast-paced. And the description starts with a quote. "What was it like living in that house?" And then it continues below. Maggie Holt is used to such questions. 25 years ago, she and her parents, Ewan and Jess, moved into Bainbury Hall, a rambling Victorian estate in the Vermont woods. They spent 3 weeks there before fleeing in the dead of night, an ordeal Ewan later recounted in a nonfiction book called House of Horrors. His tale of ghostly happenings and encounters with malevolent spirits became a worldwide phenomenon, rivaling the Amityville Horror in popularity and skepticism. Today, Maggie is a restorer of old homes and too young to remember any of the events mentioned in her father's book. But she also doesn't believe a word of it. Ghosts, after all, don't exist. When Maggie inherits Bainbury Hall after her father's death, she returns to renovate the place to prepare it for sale. But her homecoming is anything but warm. People from the past, chronicled in House of Horrors, lurk in the shadows. And locals aren't thrilled that their small town has been made infamous thanks to Maggie's father. Even more unnerving is the Bainbury Hall itself. A place filled with relics from another era that hint at a history of dark deeds. As Maggie experiences strange occurrences straight out of her father's book, she starts to believe that what he wrote was more fact than fiction. Again, I gave this one 4 stars. It was good. I was entertained. It wasn't, like, my absolute favorite. What I really liked about this book is it flips back and forth. It alternates between excerpts from Maggie's father's book and Maggie, present day, going through Bainbury Hall and figuring things out. So I really liked that juxtaposition of, like, you get a little, like, snippet of the book, and then it goes back to what Maggie is doing in the present to kind of figure out what happened while she was there as a child. But I did really like the plot of this one. I also liked, it kind of reminded me of, like, all of the documentaries that are coming out of, like, people who were child stars or people, like, talking about things that their parents did. It very much gave that vibe of, like, not a Dateline special, but, like, a true crime documentary, but it was definitely, like, I would say, like, slightly paranormal. But really liked this one. Again, if you like thrillers, you'll like Riley Sager's books. They're all, like, generally pretty good, and they're pretty fast reads. This one was 400 pages, and I think I finished it in a couple days. The next one, actually the next 2 books were kind of disappointing. The next one I really should have given it 1 star. I gave it 2, I think, because I was being nice. I don't know why I did that. But the next book was called The Shadow in the Glass, and this one I do have the physical copy of because I got it from, I can't remember if it was Half Price Books or a little library, but either way, if I spent money on it, it wasn't a lot, but I do have the physical copy. So the blurb on the back says, it's labeled as fiction and fantasy for the genre, and the moods are emotional, mysterious, and medium-paced. The blurb on the back says, "Once upon a time, Ella had wished for more than a life as a lowly maid. Now forced to work hard under the unforgiving, lecherous gaze of the man she once called stepfather, Ella's only refuge is in the books she reads by candlelight, secreted away in the library she isn't permitted to enter. One night, among her beloved books of far-off lands, Ella's wishes are answered. At the stroke of midnight, a fairy godmother makes her an offer that will change her life. 7 wishes, hers to make as she pleases. But each wish comes at a price, and Ella must decide whether it's one she's willing to pay." So, based on that blurb, you can probably tell this is a Cinderella retelling. However, it was really depressing. So, there are fantasy elements to it in that there is a fairy godmother type character, and I don't feel too bad saying this because you find out pretty early on as soon as the fairy godmother is introduced. But basically, she's given, I think it's 7 wishes by this character, and every time she makes a wish, someone dies. So, it's really dark and very gory, and I hate to even say this because if you want to read the book, it'll spoil it, but I feel like you'll see this coming. It does not have a happy ending, like even remotely. So I got to the end of the book and was mad because I had spent so much time reading it. I also would say it's not a medium-paced book. I think it was pretty slow-paced. And, like, I guess if you like historical fantasy, it's in that category. Definitely very dark. And I love a good fairy tale retelling, but this one was just disappointing to read. I did not enjoy this. I should have given it 1 star. I gave it 2 officially on Storygraph, but probably should have given it 1. Let's move on to the next one, which was disappointing, but not quite as disappointing as the other one. The next book I have is also a physical copy. Why is my phone not loading? This was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by, I'm going to try really hard not to mess up the name, Toshikazu Kawaguchi, and it's translated to English, originally in Japanese. And I picked this one up because I saw time travel on the cover, because at the top the little quote says, "What would you change if you could travel back in time?" So I thought I was picking up a science fiction book. It wasn't really science fiction, other than like, yes, time travel happens, but in a very specific, very structured way. The genres listed on Storygraph are fiction, literary, and magical realism. Magical realism is really hit or miss for me. And the moods for it were emotional, hopeful, reflective, and medium-paced. I also generally I'm not super into reflective, like, deep thought type books. This was definitely that. So the description of it is, if you could go back, who would you want to meet? In a small back alley of Tokyo, there is a cafe that has been serving carefully brewed coffee for more than 100 years. Local legend says that this shop offers something else besides coffee, the chance to travel back in time. Over the course of one summer, 4 customers visit the cafe in hopes of making that journey. But time travel isn't so simple, and there are rules that must be followed. Most important, the trip can only last as long as it takes for the coffee to get cold. Heartwarming, wistful, mysterious, and delightfully quirky, Toshikazu Kawaguchi's internationally best-selling novel explores the age-old question, what would you do if you could travel back in time? So this is told in 4 short stories, 1 for each of the customers who takes the time travel offer. And my battery's about to run out, so I'm going to change that real fast and then come back to this. Okay, we're back with a full battery. Told in a series of short stories about each one of the customers. This was definitely not as focused on the time travel stuff and more focused on the connecting with loved ones part. And I feel like if you were in the right mood, this book could be really good. I was not in that mood when I read it. It's definitely very reflective, very emotional, like kind of nostalgic, or like deals with a lot of nostalgic plot lines. It was fine. I also feel like any book that is translated, you kind of lose something when it's going through a translator. It felt very stiff, despite the topics that it was talking about. So I gave it 2 stars. Both this one and The Shadow in the Glass, I'm probably not going to keep. They're going to go into little libraries in my area. I don't feel the need to keep those in my personal collection. The last one that I have finished so far is called Ariel's Tear, A Tale of Rehaven by Justin O. Rose, and I gave this one 3 stars. This one I also have the physical copy of because I picked this up at the Milwaukee Comic-Con last year. So it is signed by the author, came with a little bookmark and everything. And I believe he said he published this through Amazon's publishing system, where you can get physical printed books by just publishing through Amazon instead of going through a traditional publisher. So I was kind of interested in picking it up for that reason, both just to see like what an Amazon published book looked like and if it was actually any good. my general consensus is, like, it was fine. It just wasn't my favorite. This one does not have a lot of reviews on Storygraph, so it doesn't have a lot of tags on it, but it's labeled as fiction and fantasy for the genres and just listed as medium paced for the mood, with nothing else. The description says, beauty is always worth protecting. Set in the fictional world of Rehaven, Ariel's Tear tells the story of, I don't know how to say this character's name. I think it's Raheuel. Yeah, tells the story of Raheuel, captain of the guards, in the small human city of Gath Odrenrock. Lots of big fantasy names here. An aging soldier haunted by memories of his bloody youth, Raheuel lives a sedate but contented life with his family. Disillusioned with warfare and the glories of his nation's conquests, he raises his children to value beauty and the wonders that enrich their lives. His peaceful world shatters, however, when a tribe of goblins threatens both Gath Odrenrock and the nearby fairy city. Intent on saving his family and on protecting the innocence of childlike fairies, Raheuel sets off on a journey to save both cities. Lifting his sword once more, he rediscovers the true cost of earthly beauty. So, I gave this one 3 stars, again, because it was entertaining, just not anything that stood out a ton for me. I will say 2 things that I enjoyed from this book are a fantasy hero main character who has a family, which does not happen very often because the main character, Raheuel, is the dad, and he has, I think, 3 kids. And 2, I think that this book included fairies in a way that didn't feel cheesy, but didn't feel like overly adult. I feel like a lot of the fairy adult books that are out now are on the spicy side, which is not usually something I go for. So this was a good, like, middle ground of, like, clearly still a book for adults, but the fairies are still, like, how you would normally picture fairies, like, very innocent, very sweet and lighthearted, and I did like that. I will say I'm not a huge fan of books that are all combat, and this one was very heavy on combat. But if you like stuff like that, you'll probably like this book. It was also very manageable. It's only 182 pages, so it was a pretty fast read. I just don't particularly enjoy books that are a lot of war descriptions. But again, it was fine. I wouldn't even necessarily be opposed to reading another book in the series. And I probably will keep it because it's a signed copy and because I got it from Comic-Con. So, it was fine. Not my favorite, not terrible. That's generally what I do for, like, a 3-star rating, is just kind of, nah. 4 stars for me is I enjoyed it. 5 stars was, like, I absolutely loved it. I really struggle with giving books 1 star. As I said earlier, I usually want to give it at least 2 just to not completely tank what it is. I do also want to talk about the books I have in progress, because I think some of them I will be done with before the end of the month. I'm currently filming this on January 25th, so I have 5 days left, so the odds of me finishing a couple of them is pretty high. So I'll go ahead and talk about the ones I am reading, especially because for a lot of them I'm more than halfway done. So I figure we'll talk about them now. They might also show up in the podcast episode where I talk about what I read in February, just to put that disclaimer out there. One of the ones I'm currently reading is The City of Ember, which is a fiction fantasy middle grade, and the moods are labeled as adventurous, mysterious, and medium paced. I have this up on my phone because I am reading it with my students at school as a read aloud book, and this is the one we're reading for fun. I'll go through these a little bit faster. I've read City of Ember before. I just knew it was a good read aloud to do with the kids. It's very sci-fi. It's labeled as fantasy. I don't think it's fantasy. It's definitely science fiction. It's a secret city underground, but the people who live there have no idea the outside world exists. They have only known living in Ember, and it's about two kids who realize that there must be a way out of Ember and try to figure out how to get out. I also know that this is the first one in a series. I don't think I've read the other books in the series, but I enjoyed this a lot as a kid, and as an adult it's still really engaging, and my students are loving reading it. So 5 stars, even though I'm not done with it yet. Since I've read it before, I can confidently say 5 stars. The next one I'm reading is number 2 in a series. So I'm currently reading Thunderhead, which is the second book in the Arc of a Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. This is what it looks like. This one is a dystopian science fiction young adult book, and the moods are adventurous, dark, tense, and medium paced. I would say this is a very dark series. The premise of the first one is that human society has advanced to a point where people no longer die because they can regenerate themselves back to the age of their choosing. So people live for hundreds of years. And in order to deal with population control, there are a group of people called scythes who their job is to glean people, so unalive them, to use TikTok terminology there. So very, very dark, but it talks a lot about ethical dilemmas in a tangible way given the state of this fictional society. So I loved the first book. It was really good, and I was kind of surprised how much I liked it. But I have read other books by Neil Shusterman before, and I would say enjoy is the wrong word for his books because they're very dark, but found them engaging books to read. So I'm pretty sure I gave Scythe 5 stars, so I was really excited to jump into the second book in the series, which is Thunderhead, which deals more with the intricacies of the Scythe society, but also the Thunderhead, so what it's named after, is this kind of digital cloud of information, but it's also sentient. So instead of a government, this society has the Thunderhead, which is a giant sentient computer program from what I can tell at this point in the book. So it goes back and forth between the Thunderhead talking about what's going on and the other characters doing what they're doing. But it's definitely a really interesting premise, very thought-provoking. Definitely high school and above to read this book because it is dark and scary. The next book is also one that we're reading aloud at school. It's called The Thief of Always by Clive Barker. On screen it'll say I'm only 28% of the way through it. We're definitely closer to 50% at this point. The 5th grade consensus on this one is we don't like this book. It's really weird. So it'll probably be a 1-star review from me. It's labeled as fiction, fantasy, horror, and middle grade. And then the moods are inspiring, mysterious, and fast-paced. I fully disagree with the inspiring one. It's just weird. There's also parts where I, as the teacher, have to pull them out because they're, actually not appropriate for a classroom setting, which is weird that this is a book in the curriculum and it's like that. But my kids do not like this book. It's one of those books that is trying too hard to be dark and edgy. If I would compare this book to something like Coraline by Neil Gaiman, I really enjoyed Coraline, which is dark and creepy and definitely for kids. But the creepiness has a purpose. The Thief of Always is a weird, backwards version of kind of Alice in Wonderland or Narnia vibes of the main character, Harvey, ends up at this place called Holiday House where it's all of the holidays in one day and there's always presents and always people to play with and all of these magical creatures, and he realizes that he can't leave. But by the time we got to the point where Harvey realized he couldn't leave, all of my kids were like, yeah, no, duh. we knew that's where the book was going, and we're only halfway through. So I don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the book, but we don't like this book. And it was published in 1992 is what Storygraph says. And it also feels like very dated, but I was born in 1994, so it's not as old as like some of the other books I talked about. But we're not fans of this book. It's like dark and edgy and creepy without reason. It doesn't feel very authentic. It feels like it's trying to have like all these like gotcha big surprise moments, and my kids are like, we saw this coming. So, do not recommend. And sorry to any other teachers who have to read this one out loud. The other two books that I'm currently reading, I'm not even going to show the pictures of them because they are both rereads. But I'm reading The Friday Night Knitting Club, which is contemporary fiction. I am rereading it because I found the sequel for it and hadn't read the sequel. If you like Gilmore Girls but don't want the annoying main character that is Rory Gilmore, highly recommend Friday Night Knitting Club. Also, it has to do with knitting, which we love here on this channel. And the other book that I'm rereading is Cinder by Marissa Meyer, which is the first book in the Lunar Chronicles series. I have read this one a couple times, but I've never read all of the books in the series back to back, and there are a couple that I haven't read at all. So I'm actually listening to those on Audible because I know that I like to revisit the series every so often, so I figured it was worth the Audible credits to go ahead and get it. But that is it for this exhaustive list of books. So I will probably do a podcast episode like this once a month at the beginning of the month to talk about the books that I read in the previous month. So this was the January 2024 episode. But I hope you enjoyed it. I do like talking about what books I'm reading. I didn't want to tack it on to my regular podcast in case this wasn't everybody's cup of tea. But I hope you enjoyed listening if you're still here. If you're still here, you must have enjoyed listening because this is going to be a long episode. But it is now over. So thank you so much for listening and watching. If you like what you saw today and want to see this and more crafty related content, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below so that you can be notified of everything I post here on YouTube. If you want to follow me in other places, that information will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment below telling me what you're reading or what you have read recently in your review. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.